The first thing that woke us up was just like almost like a firecracker going past the porthole.
It began with a sound no passenger ever wants to hear, a deep twisting and grinding of metal, followed by a jolt that tore through the steel bones of the Empress of Ireland. It was just after 2 a.m. on May 29, 1914. Most passengers had been asleep, warm in their beds, dreaming of the world waiting for them across the Atlantic. Now they were scrambling, half-dressed, to find their way back up to the upper decks. The ship had collided with something in the fog. No one could see clearly, but everyone could feel the deck rapidly tilting beneath their feet. The air was filled with the sounds of crew shouting orders and the eerie moan of twisting metal. Crewmen rushed to ready lifeboats, but confusion soon took hold as people began to panic. 2 years earlier, the Titanic had vanished beneath the waves, and the fear of a similar tragedy still lingered among passengers. Now, as the water began to rush into the passenger areas, that fear began to overtake many on board. The Empress began to list more sharply. Panic surged. Families were separated in the dark. Within minutes, water swallowed the lower decks. There was no time, no grace. Just 15 minutes, and she was gone. Out of the fog, the Storstad loomed, her own bow torn by the collision. Yet she stayed afloat, taking the desperate and the drowning aboard as the Empress of Ireland slipped beneath the St. Lawrence River, taking over 1,000 souls with her.
I was there on this wreckage alone, and I could see a couple of lifeboats, and I remember calling help, and one came over, and I got in.
Take your time.
The first thing I wanted was my mother. When my mother wasn't there, I remember I really didn't want to stay in the boat, because if she wasn't there, I didn't want to be there.
Originally celebrated for uniting Canada by rail, the Canadian Pacific Railway, formed in 1881 with sweeping federal support, soon became much more than a railroad. It was a force of national consolidation, a symbol of ambition stretching across the continent. Built with the promise of tying British Columbia to Confederation, its success came at great cost. Treaties with indigenous nations that remain contested to this day, hazardous labor conditions for Chinese workers, and an aggressive expansion policy under Sir John A. Macdonald.
My father come from Guangdong province, and that being very, very warm, he was not prepared for the cold winters. And I think all the other Chinese who came here were not prepared for the cold winters. So they came here with thin clothing, Chinese slippers, and they still had their pigtails. These people worked on the railway at the worst conditions you can think of. And of course, there was not sufficient food.
But rail alone was not enough. Determined to link Canada to the world, the CPR expanded into express freight, telegraphy, hotels, and above all, shipping. By 1891, CPR had formalized its marine arm as the Canadian Pacific Steamship Company, CPSC. Their goal was ambitious: offer seamless travel across land and sea. CPR built lines through the Maritimes and deep into the prairies, and connected the Pacific by launching transoceanic service to Asia in the late 1880s. By the dawn of the 20th century, they were ready to turn toward the Atlantic and compete with the giants of British and German steam. The RMS Empress of Ireland was born out of this vision. Commissioned in 1904 alongside her sister ship, the Empress of Britain, she was purpose-built for the transatlantic service between Canada and Europe. Designed by naval architect Francis Elgar and constructed by the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company in Govan, Scotland, she was tailored for both performance and comfort. The Empress was a twin-screw liner with a service speed of 18 knots, 570 feet in length, and displacing over 14,000 gross tons. She had twin funnels, twin propellers, and a steel hull reinforced for the brutal weather of the North Atlantic. 10 watertight bulkheads divided her hull into 11 compartments, standard for her time, and she would later be upgraded with additional lifeboats in the aftermath of the Titanic disaster. The ship could accommodate more than 1,500 passengers across 3 classes. First class was lavish, music rooms, a grand staircase, domed dining saloon, a children's dining room, and a full-service library. Second class enjoyed similar comforts on a slightly smaller scale. Third class, made up mostly of immigrants, were given clean, organized quarters with smoke rooms and access to open deck spaces. Unlike other liners of her day, class segregation was enforced more by social convention rather than at the crew's direction. Launched on the 27th of January 1906, she passed her sea trials with quiet confidence, handling well, cruising at 18 knots, and demonstrating an ability to sail smoothly even through heavy seas. Her maiden voyage began on the 29th of June 1906, departing Liverpool and pausing at Moville, Ireland to collect a large group of hopeful immigrants bound for Canada. Her third-class cabins were so overbooked, particularly with young families, that more than 100 ticketed passengers were forced to wait for the next sailing. She arrived in Quebec City on July 7th after calling at Pointe-au-Père for a river pilot and customs officials, who boarded to inspect passengers, issue travel documents, and arrange onward journeys by rail. By the 12th of July, she had turned around and headed east for her return to Liverpool. In the years that followed, the Empress of Ireland became a workhorse of the Canadian Pacific Fleet. She made seasonal voyages between Quebec and Liverpool, shifting to Halifax or St. John in the winter months when the St. Lawrence froze. By 1913, she had been fitted with wireless telegraphy and assigned the call sign MPL. Over 8 years of faithful service, she completed 95 round trips, carrying nearly 120,000 westbound passengers to Canada, immigrants, tourists, businessmen, families, and returning another 67,000 eastbound.
For 8 years, it brought tens of thousands of Canadians over to their new homes in Canada, and then bringing people back to the old world to show off what they accomplished in Canada. Here's your new grandchild, here's a picture of the farm. So it's a huge building block for what Canada is today.
She was not the grandest ship of her age. She lacked the headlines of Cunard's Lusitania or White Star's Olympic. But the Empress of Ireland was dependable, respected, and in the minds of many who sailed aboard her, unforgettable. A proud child of CPR's grand experiment in transcontinental and transatlantic unity, linking the wheat fields of the prairies to the ports of Liverpool. She carried not just people, but a promise that Canada was no longer isolated, no longer young, and no longer merely a place between oceans. The Empress of Ireland slipped her moorings at Quebec City in the late afternoon of May 28, 1914. Bound for Liverpool, she carried 1,477 souls, tourists, missionaries, immigrants, and a seasoned crew. At the helm was Captain Henry George Kendall, a man as composed as he was seasoned. Born in London in 1874 and raised in Liverpool, Kendall had begun his maritime life at 14. By the time he assumed command of the Empress in May 1914, he was a veteran of high seas and high drama, having once used wireless telegraphy to expose a murderer aboard the Montrose. The crew respected him, as did the passengers, and for good reason. Below decks, Chief Engineer William Sampson, a 53-year-old man from Liverpool, oversaw the heart of the vessel. He had been with the ship since her fitting out and had completed 96 crossings. Around him worked engineers like Robert Henry Brennan and stewards like Harold Jones and the Baker brothers Stanley and Harry, each a cog in the finely tuned machine of transatlantic travel. In the medical quarters, ship surgeon Dr. James F. Grant, just 26, tended to the health of those aboard. On only his second voyage, the young doctor from Victoria had trained at McGill and interned at Montreal General. Quietly capable, he worked from cabin 300 with a small operating room at the stern, ready for anything the crossing might bring. The passenger list reflected the breadth of the empire: 87 in first class, 253 in second, and 717 in third. Families, actors, ministers, and children. Among them were Lawrence Irving and Mabel Hackney, a celebrated theatrical couple rushing home after a tour, Henry Lyman, a philanthropist from Montreal with his young wife, and a sea of Salvation Army delegates, nearly 170 strong, bound for an international congress in London. One of them was Grace Hannigan, just 7 years old, traveling with her mother and bandmaster father from Toronto. As the Empress cleared the pilot station near Pointe-au-Père in the early hours of May 29th, the SS Storstad steamed westward on a reciprocal course. A Norwegian collier launched in 1910 from the Armstrong Whitworth shipyards, the Storstad was built for burden, not beauty. At 440 feet long and over 6,000 gross tons, she was the largest vessel yet constructed using the Isherwood longitudinal framing system, ideal for her work in hauling iron ore and coal across the Atlantic. Her blunt bow, designed for ice breaking and cargo resilience, would soon prove catastrophic. On her bridge stood First Officer Alfred Toftenis, competent and experienced, though now nearly blind in a sudden bank of fog. Both ships had spotted each other hours earlier in clear weather, but visibility quickly dissolved. Fog whistles blared into the night, and aboard the Empress, Captain Kendall ordered the engines stopped and then reversed. The ship hung in the murk, her whistles warning of her intentions. Then, at 1:56 a.m., the Storstad emerged from the gray veil and rammed the Empress between the first and second funnels. Her steel bow carved open a fatal wound on the starboard side. Kendall shouted to the Storstad to hold fast and plug the breach with her hull, but the Empress's forward motion and the river's current tore the two ships apart. 60,000 gallons of water per second surged into the wounded liner.
The first thing that woke us up was just like a almost like a firecracker going past the porthole, and we didn't know what it was. And we got out of bed, very little was said, and somebody at this moment knocked at our door, and we went out as we were and got up to the deck.
In the engine room, Sampson acted swiftly, ordering watertight doors shut and urging Kendall via telephone to beach the ship. "Do the best you can," came the reply. But it was too late. The list grew severe, the engines failed, and power gave out. Darkness fell below decks. Above, Steward Harold Jones gathered passengers and brought them toward the lifeboats. He was last seen descending once more into the ship to help others. On the port side, the lifeboats hung useless, suspended over water now far below due to the ship's list. Only 5 starboard lifeboats were launched successfully, others capsized. In a haunting moment of fraternal sacrifice, Stanley Baker stood on the safe side of a watertight door. His older brother Harry, trapped on the other, told him to go. Stanley survived. Harry did not.
My name's Lynn Andrews. I'm the granddaughter of Stanley James Baker, who was bellboy in first class on the Empress of Ireland. And his brother was a steward, Harry. He was 19. He was down in, I don't know what room it was at all, but it was a watertight door. I think he was with other stewards. And when the Empress was hit, my granddad went down below deck and started hammering on the door and trying to open it. But unfortunately, he couldn't open it. And his brother just shouted, "You go, jump, jump." So my granddad jumped into the water. And the next thing he knew, he was just hauled into a lifeboat.
In the dark, amid groaning steel and the rising flood, Dr. Grant was seen helping the injured. Then he too was washed into the sea. 10 minutes after impact, the Empress of Ireland rolled onto her starboard side. Hundreds of souls, those lucky enough to escape their cabins, crawled out of portholes and clambered onto the exposed hull. For a breathless moment, it seemed the ship had grounded, but at 2:10 a.m., the bow rose, shuddered, and slipped beneath the surface. In 14 minutes, the pride of Canadian Pacific was gone. No time for distress calls, no possibilities for second chances, just fog, steel, and the cold grip of the St. Lawrence. When the Empress of Ireland slipped beneath the St. Lawrence River in the early morning gloom of May 29, 1914, she took with her 1,012 souls in just 14 minutes. Survivors clung to wreckage in total darkness. The Storstad would become their unlikely lifeline. Despite her own damaged bow and a stunned crew, Storstad's men scrambled to deploy lifeboats and drag as many survivors as possible from the frigid current. Their efforts, though swift and sincere, could not match the speed of the sinking. Of the 1,477 aboard the Empress, only 465 lived to tell of it. Among the rescued was Captain Henry George Kendall, thrown from the bridge into the river and nearly dragged under with the ship. He clung to a wooden grate until pulled into lifeboat number 3. Once aboard, he resumed command, aiding in the rescue of over 60 people from the water. Lifeboats ferried survivors back and forth between Storstad and the wreck site.
It's a very emotional thing. It's something that was very important to my great-grandfather. Even on his deathbed, he was reliving the events that happened that day. He always felt that he should have gone down with his ship and had nightmares about it all his life.
On shore, the distress signal, brief though it was received. The steamers Eureka and Lady Evelyn responded swiftly. Eureka arrived first at 3:10 a.m., rescuing around 150 survivors. Lady Evelyn followed shortly after, collecting the 200 brought aboard Storstad, along with 133 recovered bodies. On board, Dr. Grant, a passenger rescued by Storstad, treated the injured tirelessly. Survivors were housed and tended to in nearby Rimouski. Many stories emerged from that morning. William Sampson, pulled from the engine room by the ship's butcher. Grace Hannigan lost both parents, but would survive by clinging onto wreckage. However, countless others would never make it.
I thought that I was with my mother and father. The three of us, I thought, landed in the water together. And it seemed like I was my father was floating and I was on top of him. And then I was there on this wreckage alone. And I could see a couple of lifeboats. And I remember calling help. And one came over and I got in.
Okay. Take your time.
The first thing I wanted was my mother. And they, of course, tried to calm me down. When my mother wasn't there, I remember I really didn't want to stay in the boat because if she wasn't there, I didn't want to be there.
When did you really know that your parents were dead?
I realized my father was because I saw him at the undertaker's. but my mother's body was never found. And I just couldn't accept it. I've had it for probably over a year that she was really gone. I used to think, going along the street, that I might run into her.
The Canadian government moved quickly to investigate. On June 16th, a royal commission convened in Quebec City, led by Lord Mersey, already seasoned from inquiries into Titanic. Assisting him were Sir Adolphe Bazile-Routhier and Chief Justice Ezekiel MacLeod. They were tasked with answering 20 questions, from whether proper lookouts were kept to whether regulations under the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, SOLAS, had been followed. Testimony came from 61 witnesses, crew, passengers, wireless operators, divers, and maritime experts. What emerged were two irreconcilable accounts. Captain Kendall claimed clear weather turned to sudden fog, that Empress slowed, signaled, and was struck despite proper action. Storstad's crew, led by Chief Officer Toftenes, reported confusion over light signals and believed the Empress had altered course unpredictably. The commission sided with Kendall. They concluded Storstad had ported her helm during fog, changed course to starboard, and initiated the collision. Toftens was specifically faulted for failing to summon Captain Anderson when fog first appeared. Anderson, for his part, publicly rebuked the ruling, calling Lord Mersey a fool and vowing legal action. Beyond blame, the inquiry illuminated tragic oversights, watertight doors not closed, longitudinal bulkheads that worsened flooding, and open portholes that invited water as the ship listed. The speed of the sinking was as much a structural failure as navigational error. In the wake of the tragedy, the survivors found themselves caught between grief and public scrutiny. Some, like Salvation Army member Grace Hannigan, became living symbols of loss. Of the 167 Salvationists aboard, only 8 survived. Captain Kendall, though cleared, returned to sea in a shore-bound role and never truly escaped the night's shadow. The ship herself was salvaged in the weeks after. Divers retrieved mail, silver bullion, and most importantly, bodies. One diver, Edward Casaboom, was killed, a grim reminder of the wreck's danger. CPR filled the void with another ship, the Virginian, and life began returning to normal. The disaster hastened the end of hazardous longitudinal bulkheads and prompted a re-evaluation of hull design. Naval architects cited Empress of Ireland to argue for raked bows and safer compartmentalization. Lifeboat drills and fog procedures also grew more rigorous as a result of the sinking. For decades, the Empress rested largely forgotten. World War I erupted 2 months later, sweeping her from public memory.
When you have 5,000 people dying in the trenches every day 6 weeks later, after the Empress sunk, then losing 1,012 kind of pales in comparison.
But divers found her again in the 1960s and 70s, retrieving artifacts, sounding the call for preservation. In 1999, Quebec declared the wreck a historic and archaeological site, the first underwater site to receive such status.
He never really said an awful lot about it, only that the Empress of Ireland never got the recognition, and there were more lives lost on the Empress than the Titanic and the Lusitania. He never really quite got over that.
Today, the wreck of the Empress rests in the cold, silt-heavy waters of the St. Lawrence River near Rimouski, Quebec. A twisted, broken hull lying on its starboard side, slowly succumbing to rust and time.
Eventually, one day is going to be a pile of debris, and even that's going to disappear. It's going to be silted out, so nothing is going to be left to testify to what happened and to that piece of history, Canadian history.
It is a protected site now, designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 2009. But for decades, it lured divers with its haunting silence and remnants of lives cut short. Many artifacts recovered over the years are displayed at the Empress of Ireland Museum in Pointe-au-Père, a stone's throw from where the ship went down. The memory of those lost is preserved above the waterline as well. In Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Toronto, a large Celtic cross stands watch over a mass grave containing 167 victims. Similar markers dot cemeteries across Canada and the United Kingdom, quiet, enduring reminders of a tragedy overshadowed by the First World War. Perhaps the most poignant is the monument at Pointe-au-Père itself. Stark, clean lines, inscribed names, and the open sky above. Not grand, not loud, but steadfast. A site for reflection, not spectacle. For years, the disaster of the Empress lived in the shadows. These memorials push back against that forgetting. They stand for more than a shipwreck. They speak for hundreds of lives and the fragility that binds all our journeys. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end of the video. If you found this story interesting and want to explore other historical people, places, and events, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. I'd also love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with topics you'd like us to feature in future episodes. I'm working to build a community around these videos, and your thoughts on potential topics or ways to improve the channel are more than welcome. Your support makes this channel possible, and I'm excited to keep sharing these incredible stories with you.